Our next expert is Murray Hunt, who's visiting professor in human rights law at Oxford University, the director of the Bingham Centre for the Rule of Law, and the UK's alternate member of the Council of Europe's Commission for Democracy through Law, which you may better known as the Venice Commission. Murray was previously the legal advisor to the Joint Committee on Human Rights of the UK Parliament, and there he advised the joint the committee and drafted reports to Parliament on human rights compatibility of government bills, the implementation by the government of human rights judgments, the UK's compliance with international human rights treaties, and significant human rights issues of national concern. Murray, thank you very much for coming. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much indeed. Good evening, everybody. Apologies for my voice, which I'm just recovering from a cold. So I hope you can all hear me at the back. Excellent. So it's a real pleasure to be here this evening. I was thinking on my way down here, trying to think myself into your heads. What would I want to know if I were your age? And I suddenly was struck with horror at the realization of how long ago it was that I was your age. And sitting on the panel here, I also feel like I'm the oldest person here. And so any kind of advice I can impart has to be qualified by the realization that my experiences are from some time back in the mists of the distant past. It was nearly 40 years ago, in fact, that 40 years next month, that I came up here for an interview to study law across the road at Keble College as an 18-year-old from a state school. I think looking a bit like Gareth Southgate, actually, because I don't know if you've seen Dear England, but Gareth Southgate, the England manager, was from Crawley. And his image advisors told him that he needed to wear a waistcoat on the touchline. I actually came to my interview wearing a waistcoat. Can't remember who advised me to do that. But so I went to Keble to study law back in the 1980s. To be honest, it was a bit dull. I didn't massively enjoy being a law student. I had come to Oxford knowing that I was really interested in politics, but also in law. I had a very strong interest in politics. In fact, my mother thought there was something a bit wrong with me because as a 10-year-old, she was worried that I used to rush home from school to watch the coverage of the US presidential election campaign when Jimmy Carter was running for president, and she thought I should be out playing football. But I knew that I had this interest in politics, but I also had an interest in law. And this is going to be one of the threads, to pick up Arabella's comment, that's run through my own career, and one of the things that I want to sort of suggest to you in terms of advice. Knowing what you really care about and are passionate about, having the self-consciousness to sort of know what drives you and motivates you are incredibly important in making your career choices. So this is going to be one of my themes is going to be listen to your heart in terms of what interests you and what drives and motivates you, because you will then end up doing something that you're really motivated by. So I did an undergraduate law degree. Because of my interest in politics, I was particularly interested in constitutional law and administrative law. Those were the subjects that I most enjoyed as an undergraduate lawyer. I made the mistake, both in my undergraduate degree and in the BCL, which I then went on to do for a year, of being over-influenced by my tutors. So I particularly remember in the BCL year, going to my tutor, who was a contract lawyer, and saying, I really want to do the comparative human rights law course because I'm really interested in human rights. And I regrettably, when I look back, allowed him to talk me out of it on the basis that that actually what I was good at the time was the kind of much more black letter, hardcore doctrinal law stuff. So I was over-influenced by that advice and did quite hardcore BCL courses, remedies in contracts and tort and so on, which I don't regret in the sense that they do then equip you very well to be able to do that sort of law. But I was talked out of following my heart at that stage because I think my particular tutor thought that human rights law was a bit sort of fluffy and not really political, not really legal, proper legal. So that again is another bit of my reflections. Definitely go with your instincts and your preferences and your passions when you're choosing your courses and your subjects. That will pay you dividends in the long run. So I then spent a year teaching here as a lecturer, constitutional and administrative law. So these were the subjects which I was particularly interested in. I was really a public lawyer, particularly interested in the relationship between law and politics, which is why I was drawn to those subjects. I then, after that year, went to spend a year in the States, studied at Harvard doing a master's for 1 year. And I think that was really one of the best things I ever did, So another bit of advice from me would be, if you do have the opportunity to go and study in another legal system, another political system, another jurisdiction, do everything you can to do that, because it was an extraordinarily eye-opening exercise for me. The legal education was, compared to my undergraduate, I have not been disrespectful to Oxford here, it was a long time ago, was just a lot more interesting. There was a lot more multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary work. There were a lot of people in my classes who had a previous life in doing interesting things. And there were a lot more people from different subject matter backgrounds who were actually involved and engaged in teaching and studying law. So my year of studying law in the States was very eye-opening for me and very, very formative. And it also actually gave me my main claim to fame, which was that I was in the same constitutional law class as Barack Obama, which was a very privileged thing to do. He was very charismatic in these classes, and the tutors always listened very carefully when he spoke. So I came back from the States again with a very strong interest in constitutionalism. This was my emerging kind of passion, really. I had studied there, in particular, constitutional law. Going as an English public lawyer, it was interesting to see how courts had this role, which was very different from what we were used to in the UK. And I was very intrigued by these contrasts between a sort of ostensibly parliamentary sovereignty-based system that the UK has, and these constitutional systems, such as the United States, where the courts have this extraordinary power to be able to strike down legislation which has been passed by the democratic branches. So already by that early stage, it was clear what my sort of areas of interest were and what I wanted to do. So I came back from there knowing, though, that I didn't want to be an academic. So I went to the bar. So I qualified as a barrister. I knew that I wanted to work in this particular area, but I wanted to do something practical and applied. So I went to the bar, qualified, did my bar school. I actually also spent another year in Canada, just to go back to my theme of take every opportunity you can to do comparative work and work in different jurisdictions. Between doing my bar school year and my pupillage, the Middle Temple, the inn I was a member of, had some fellowships which enabled you to go and spend a year in Toronto. And I spent that year attached to the law school and attached to a law firm. And I was looking there at this question of the Charter, of the Canadian Charter of Rights, and how that appeared to be trying to tread some sort of middle path between US constitutionalism and the UK rather idiosyncratic arrangements. So I spent a year studying that in Canada, came back to do pupillage. While I was doing pupillage, I was really sort of writing up. I never did a doctorate. I sort of wrote up what I'd been studying in those previous years into a little book, which was with an eye to the fact that I was going to the bar, called Using Human Rights Law in English Courts, worst title in the world. But it had that sort of functional title because what I was really interested in was how human rights law could actually be used in litigation in the UK in a practical way, which might make a difference to outcomes in cases. Notwithstanding the fact that we had this parliamentary sovereignty-based system, the European Convention on Human Rights wasn't part of our law. We didn't have a constitution which enabled courts to have this strong muscular role that I'd seen in other systems. So I did some writing at the same time as I was qualifying. Again, that's another thing I would strongly encourage. If you have the urge, as Daniela was describing, to be involved in these debates, follow that urge. And it is possible to do that at the same time as you're qualifying. So if you hear that voice, then try to follow that as well. I then went into practice as a public law barrister. In those days, this was pre-Human Rights Act, so we're going back again into the mist of time. If you wanted to do practice in that sort of area, in constitutional and administrative law, the bar was organised in a very particular way. You had to go to a set of barristers' chambers which specialised in what ostensibly sound like pretty boring and dull things. So the barristers' chambers that I went to was basically a set of planning law chambers. But that was where there was a concentration of public lawyers. So a lot of people there did planning inquiries, but a lot of people did judicial review. And it was judicial review that was the type of litigation in which it was possible to be a constitutional lawyer in the UK. So within that chambers, I began to develop a practice in what in other countries would be constitutional law, including, to the extent it was possible before the Human Rights Act, human rights law. But after a while, it became clear that actually the bar was organized in such a way that it didn't really facilitate those kinds of practice areas. And in the late 90s, when we had this sudden raft of legislation, the Human Rights Act, the Freedom of Information Act, the devolution legislation, it was a very particular time when domestic law was being permeated by international law. Seems like a very, very long time ago today. But there was definitely this sense of quite exciting opportunities where our legal system and our political system, to a large extent, were looking outward and was receptive to international standards, to norms that had been generated elsewhere. And the really big challenge for practitioners, I think, at that stage was how to try and make sure that those were inculcated into our domestic legal system and actually grounded in a political way and taken ownership of, so that they would be long lasting. So with some other barristers at the bar, we felt that actually the bar wasn't really organized to encourage that sort of practice. And because there were these chambers where there were 80 criminal lawyers, 80 planning lawyers, everything was organized in these silos. There were no places where there were people who were specializing in these cross-cutting constitutional type, human rights type of cases. So a small group of people established a new practice, which was called matrix chambers, which meant that the whole idea of which was to bring together a smaller number of people who were practicing in these cognate areas which overlap with each other. And just looking back, that would be another of my words of advice. Don't necessarily accept the institutions that you're working in have to be the way they are, because there's often a lot of like-minded people who may have your frustrations that you're having with your particular part of the system that you're working in. So always reach out and be open to having those conversations across silos outside of your compartments to find out where there are other people who are thinking similar things and what the opportunities and possibilities might be to actually change those structures. Because actually sometimes it's quite surprising how easy it can be. So that's definitely reflecting on my career path, something I would also strongly encourage you to do. Never be oppressed by those structures that you're working within. There are always some opportunities to do something about them. After 9/11, everything changed in terms of human rights law in the UK, and it became clear that the government which had introduced the Human Rights Act and this raft of legislation in the late 1990s was not going to be very sympathetic and friendly towards the new framework it had introduced. So my career then took a different path, and I then went to work like Arabella in Parliament as the legal advisor, as Freya mentioned, to the Joint Committee on Human Rights, because it was clear to me that at that stage, the early 2000s, there was a real need for the democratic system to take ownership of these rights. And they weren't going to last in our legal system if we relied purely on courts and lawyers to uphold them. So the Human Rights Committee for me was a really important part of the machinery and the architecture, which we needed to build up and to make sure that it was trying to get Parliament, and in particular the elected part of Parliament, to constantly debate and discuss these human rights so that they began to become literate in them and understand them and begin to actually identify with them and talk about Article 10 of the European Convention on Human Rights in the same way that the First Amendment is discussed in the US. So that was the next 13 years of my life working in the Joint Committee on Human Rights. And that was an extremely fulfilling role in which I was able to use this lifelong interest in law and politics. One other reflection for you all, I would say, is if you're thinking about being a human rights lawyer, but you're not sure if you're doing it because you want to be a politician, do try and resolve that in your head, because I think it's really important to go into being a human rights lawyer, knowing whether or not actually you want to be a politician rather than a human rights lawyer. I think you need to work out your relationship in your mind between those two things. If you think you're a wannabe politician, but in the meantime want to be a human rights lawyer, work that out first, I would say, because I think in my view, the best human rights lawyers are the ones who can operate in the political process, in the political system, but they've got a really clear idea and they've worked out in their mind exactly what the relationship is between law and politics, what their role is in relation to that, and what the roles of the different institutions are in relation to law and politics. The ones that, in my view, often come unstuck are the wannabe politicians who become human rights lawyers and then become less effective human rights lawyers because they're really politicians. There are of course politicians who form human rights lawyers, including the current leader of the opposition. I'll probably got better comments on what happens if you go in that direction. But having said that, there are also lots of politicians who are former lawyers who clearly were always politicians. And then there are some politicians who are former lawyers who remain what I would call proper lawyers. Those are the types of politicians that we need to become our law officers and the ones who hold those responsible positions in government in relation to law. So I'll wrap up. Since 2017, I left Parliament and worked in the Bingham Centre for the Rule of Law. That runs a policy and evidence centre on modern slavery and human rights, which, picking up again on one of my colleagues' comments about policy, I think Daniela was talking about the importance of policy work, tries again to work very much with human rights law in the political space, trying to influence policy making, trying to spell out what's the positive obligations in the field of modern slavery and human trafficking that are incumbent on states, what they mean in practice for actual policy, and trying to work closely with policymakers to flesh out what those policies mean, what a proper human rights regarding human rights implementing, promoting and fulfilling system looks like for that particular legal right. So looking back, I think I've remained true to my 10-year-old self of being very interested in politics, but it is possible to have a career as a lawyer and as a practicing lawyer and as an academic lawyer, which still preserves that interest in politics and crosses between the two. Thank you very much.